Tonight, I am thrilled to be welcoming Leila Taylor to discuss her first book, Darkly, Black History and America's Gothic Soul. Here to say a little bit more about the book and about Leila is Lena Dawes, author of What Are You Doing Here? A Black Woman's Life and Liberation in Heavy Metal, and a critic whose writing can be found in Hazlitt, Spin, The Wire, NPR, and many more. So please join me in welcoming Lena to the Strand.
Go. Okay, so I wanted to do another introduction for Leila. As a self-described AfroGothic, Leila began her journey as a goth kid in her hometown of Detroit, Michigan. After attending graduate programs at both Yale University and the New School, where we met almost 5 years ago, she decided to continue the research she started as a student in the Liberal Studies department by conducting ethnographic research and presenting at conferences in New York, England, and Mexico. Leila is an insightful and thoughtful writer, a graphic designer, and the creative director for Brooklyn Public Library, where, similar to her book, she regularly uses her artistic sensibilities to find beauty in the most unexpected places. As her friend and a fellow writer, it's been a joy to see all the work Leila has done over the last couple of years come to fruition with this wonderful book. And with that, I wanted to start off with the first question.
Yeah.
So in this book is being released at the same time as an online social movement that capitalizes on Black alternative youth culture gains prominence through online platforms such as Afropunk or Punk Black. However, there is an emphasis on the aesthetics, clothing, hairstyles, and perceived nonconformist attitudes that position Afro-Goths as pointedly outside of mainstream culture, yet their images are often co-opted by mainstream media for consumer purposes. Your book notes this movement, but also takes an alternative view on what is goth and the Gothic. How do you position goth in your book, Darkly?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a little bit of issue with the term Afro-Goth, I think because of that. I mean, goth is a subculture based on a music genre. It's a music, and it's about the subculture and the fashion and everything that came through that, right? And when I started, I was looking at, what are the experience of Black goths, right? And what is that like to be sort of twice marginalized, But what you kind of realize is, Black goths are pretty much the same as white goths or Mexican goths or whatever, because, we all like the same stuff. We all like the same kind of music. We all pretty much dress the same. That's kind of the point of being in a subculture, But the difference in being a Black goth in America is that you're a Black person in America. So instead of the focus being on goth and the fashion of it, which is kind of what Afro-Goth is kind of leaned towards, I'm much more interested in the Afro-Gothic, because the Gothic is a much broader term, right? Gothic is a descriptor. It's a point of view. It's a way of describing just about anything that has this certain number of qualifications or certain attributes. Like how I define it, how I think about the Gothic is a romanticization of melancholy, the aesthetics of mourning or mourning as a performance. It's about the use of fear as a means of expression or a means of working through sort of trauma. Fear is pleasure, the enjoyment of that. It's all of those negative emotions that we're supposed to resist, that we're supposed to be afraid of, that we're supposed to be repulsed by. The Gothic embraces that. And I think that there are similarities to the experience of Blackness to the attributes of the Gothic. I think that sort of the continued subjugation and objectification of Black people, there's a certain monsterization in that, which I think is very Gothic. There's an otherness in that, which is very Gothic. There's also sort of the display of death and the prominence of death in Black culture, which feels like a very kind of Gothic experience. There's also, and I think you're going to talk a little bit about liminality of this being sort of not in one place or the other, right? So I think that instead of it being Afro-Goth, I think the Gothic really talks about the wholeness of the Black American experience. And not only that, but all of that residual guilt and trauma that's been left over since chattel slavery. The fact that slavery never really ended. It just kind of changed its name and changed its tactics, all of that tension and anxiety and guilt kind of has to go somewhere, right? And I think where it goes is in the culture. I think all of that sort of fury and despair and again, guilt, because I think there is a great deal of repressed denial in this country about what we've done from the start. And all that has to come out. It can't just stay buried. And I think it comes out in art and in music and in literature. And I think that's what the American Gothic is all of that trauma coming to the surface. Yeah.
Okay. Now, one thing that I just wanted to share with you when I was going through this book, and I was like super excited because there's so many incredible passages. There's just so many thoughtful nuances in this book.
There's a lot of stuff in there.
I wanted to read it all to you, but we'd be here for 5 hours, so I won't.
It's jam-packed.
It's jam-packed of goodness and fun, kind of. But there are two sections that I wanted to, two short quotes I wanted to read to you from the book, and then I'm going to ask Leila to kind of elaborate and kind of riff on these quotes. The first one is, actually I'm going to do one and then the other.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first one is, both goth and blackness are performative identities with foundations in transgression, a familiarity with death and aestheticized mourning, and a keen awareness of the darker side of human nature.
I think, and that goes a little bit with what I was saying before about kind of the definitions of goth and the difference between goth and gothic. But there's a great quote by Sasa Jenkins, who's the lead singer of this punk band called the 1865. And he says, when you're black, you're punk rock all the time. And there's also a really great passage that Fred Moten talks about how the essence of blackness is resistance against objectification, like the resistance against the dominating culture, the resistance against this stuff is inherent in the Black experience. And because we're othered already, because we're already sort of deemed monstrous many times, I think that becomes sort of this defining element of what the goth is, or what the Gothic is in Blackness, because you're already sort of twice marginalized, like I said before, so you're already kind of on the edge, and that's just an inherent part of it. And I think one of the things that I love so much about that quote from Fred Moten is that one of the things that I think is interesting about his work is this idea of, I guess I could call it sort of like actually, no, go ahead. I completely lost what I was going to say.
Okay, does everyone know? Yeah.
I know, I was like, Fred Moten's awesome, but I forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah, does everyone know who Fred Moten is? He's a professor at NYU.
He's a poet and a scholar and a philosopher. And he has really great things to say that I can't remember right now.
Yeah, very, very dense work.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to skip the second question because you answered in the first. The next question I have for you is, this book is presented as a collection of observations that on first take are non-linear, but all lead back to the same theme: beauty through both willing and forced alienation from normative culture. I think that they are non-linear because you are writing about things on the surface that would never be considered as part of a goth aesthetic. Are you challenging popular culture in a way suggesting that readers think between the lines of what is offered to us and think about what is real?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have these sort of preconceived notions of what the Gothic is, and there are sort of classic representations of that are kind of undeniable. The Mysteries of Udolpho is a Gothic novel. no one would question it. The Monk is a Gothic novel and things like that. But there's things in Black culture, because of the situation and because of our history, that have the same kind of Gothic elements. And one of the things I talk about a lot is Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, which I think is the gothest song ever. And part of that is because it's talking about a real incident, an actual real lynching of 2 men in Indiana. So it comes from a place of truth, and it comes from a place of real pain. But it's sung in her incredible voice, which has this strange quality to it. And
Can I interrupt?
Yeah,
In the book, she says, when I first listened to Billie Holiday, I thought there was something wrong with her.
Right? It was weird. And I'm used to, like, you know, Wham and shit. So, I mean, when I heard that, I was like, I didn't know what to think. So you have this, this completely unique, uncanny voice with these lyrics that are bucolic and lovely, the magnolia trees, combined with super disturbing imagery, like the smell of burning flesh. And I think that's what the kind of Gothic does. It takes things that are horrific and kind of blends them into things that are kind of beautiful and evocative. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned when talking about Strange Fruit, which I never thought about, was like the southernness.
Mm-hmm.
And like how the southernness in general leads into the Gothic.
Yeah.
In terms of you write about like envisioning, you know, these beautiful women, you know, dressed to the nines, slowly fanning themselves in the heat, in the oppressive heat. And
Beyonce's Lemonade video.
Well, besides
that, yeah.
But I mean, there's a romanticism and a beauty about how you describe these characters in the South. And then you lead into the Southern Gothic, which just for me personally, like it was a really interesting, I never really thought about not only the history of slavery and the history of Jim Crow, but also in terms of the aesthetics and how people moved within that space kind of leads to this underlying feeling of, in some ways, melancholy.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the Southern Gothic, because I think when people think of American Gothic or the Gothic in America, they think Southern Gothic.
Right.
And while there are kind of similarities in their origin, in that Southern Gothic literature kind of has its origin in the malaise and the confusion and the loss of identity after slavery and what the South meant and the kind of loss of this whatever white Southern identity. But the Southern Gothic canon is told by white voices, you know, so it's not telling the story of where that malaise came from. It's telling it through the perspective of the victory, even though they lost, you know. So I think, and I'm not from the South, and I kind of have a little bit of envy sometimes when I think of that, because I do think that there is a closeness in the heart of sort of all of this that we're talking about in the Black Gothic that kind of that originates from there, you know, that has spread. And I think that, you know, Billie Holiday did it. And the other thing, speaking of the South, is the other sort of work of art that I think is ideal for Black Gothic is Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Right.
Which again is based on an actual true story, you know. So I think part of my sort of questioning southernness in the Gothic is also a little bit kind of questioning myself a little bit, and the fact that I felt this sort of distinct distance or something. Like I never went to a historically Black college, you know. I didn't have these kind of experiences of Southern Blackness that a lot of people had. That has that kind of very Southern Gothic aesthetic or whatever. And in a way, I kind of regret it a little bit somehow. I don't know.
But you were raised in Detroit.
Yeah.
And I found that your discussions about Detroit were really interesting. Like, how did you become a goth kid in Detroit? When I think of Detroit, I think of Black people.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
of soul, and I think of
Motown.
Motown,
Yeah.
and but you really use Detroit a lot in this book, kind of as a foundational tool.
Yeah.
In terms
yeah.
of who you are as a person.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
also kind of how you discovered the Gothic.
Yeah.
You position the city as a vibrant space and home versus ruin porn, a notion that denotes the human population and suggests that this supposedly abandoned city is literally begging for gentrification. So how did the city inspire you in writing this book?
Detroit's a very Gothic city. Like, its nickname is the Renaissance City. And like the high school I went to was Renaissance. And our mascot was a phoenix, you know. So there's this idea of this continual burning and renewal and burning and rising. I call it the Revenant City. It's just dying and coming back over and over and over again, you know. And growing up there, I didn't really know or care about, declining economic factors or infrastructure crumbling apart. But we would be driving down the street and it would be empty lot, house, ruined house, empty lot, house. So this patchwork of ruination was just sort of part of the landscape and part of the visual landscape, which added this kind of spookiness to the place. Ruins are sort of a foundational element in Gothic. The ruined castle, the ruined house in the middle of nowhere, But the thing with Detroit ruins and modern ruins, and you mentioned ruin porn, I have a love-hate relationship with ruin porn because I love these images. And there was this time a few years ago where like the ruins of Detroit was a really kind of hot thing for a while. And there were all these coffee table books of these images that were so uncanny, like an office inside, and the entire floor is just covered in moss like it's a forest. Or a basketball court in a high school that's so warped, it looks like, waves, So it's so tantalizing to see a little bit like, what would life be like without people? Like, what would the post-apocalyptic world look like when nature takes over? But it's right there. And it's buildings that you went to, and it's the mall you went to, and it's the school you used to go to. But the problem with these images is that they never have people in them. And it becomes this sort of fetishized look at poverty. Because the reason why those images exist are because of economic failure, sort of the failure of capitalism, economic disparity, indifference, political corruption. And every ruined house had a family in it at some point.
Right.
Every ruined building or school had teachers in it, or factory workers, or people with jobs, So you're not just looking at these gorgeous, evocative images, you are looking at lost lives, But the other thing that they do is, like, there's this great image of a school, and I think, like, the clock is melted, and there's, like, beakers from the science lab all over the place. It just looks like time stood still. It was Cass Tech High School. What they don't show you is that they built a brand new Cass Tech right across the street. But that's not really sexy to see the brand new shiny Cass Tech. You don't want to see the ruined Cass Tech. And I think actually, one of the people I think kind of does this right, this balance of Gothicness in the city, is Jim Jarmusch in Only Lovers Left Alive. Because he really uses the city as sort of this built-in kind of mise-en-scène for horror. If you haven't seen it, Adam, who's this vampire, lives in this gorgeous ruined Queen Anne house in this once very posh neighborhood in Detroit called Brush Park. And it's completely isolated. The building next to him has been torn down. There's nothing but growth and weeds, and you hear like the distant howl of a dog or a wolf every now and then. It's completely dark all the time. But when they go through the city, he's with Eve, his wife, Tilda Swinton, and they kind of look at these ruins with a kind of wistful melancholy, with a romanticism about it, as opposed to it being kind of gawkery, And Eve, I hope I can quote this right, but she says something like, this city will rise again, or something. There's water here. And when the cities in the South are burning, this place will bloom. And because they're vampires and they've lived for eons, they're kind of looking at this city through the scope of centuries, not just the past 50 years or so. And they also show life. They go see bands, they go see music. You know, they're people in this world. So as opposed to the ruin porn version of it, I think he's kind of using the ruins of Detroit in a positive way that feels the way I experienced it, which was a little bit, you know, romantic. I mean, and in terms of like how I became a goth kid, I mean, we had really great radio stations in Detroit, and my friends, we would go to record stores and get like Susie and the Banshees albums and, you know, whatever. And I probably discovered Anne Rice the same time I discovered Susie and the Banshees. So it just sort of formed who I was. And also I think I went to a very kind of hippie Quaker school, which was very diverse. So it wasn't as kind of segregated in terms of, it was very diverse in terms of religion and races and class. So and my parents are academics. So I was fortunate that I had an upbringing that was very heavy on the arts and exposure to the arts, and kind of loose enough that my parents would just sort of pick a book off the shelf and they just let me read it. Like I read Jean-Paul Sartre when I was like seventh grade, and I tried to do a book report on Age of Reason, which makes no sense. I would love to see that book report someday. Yeah, and I think what ended up happening is I was always fascinated by death and by the supernatural. And when I found the music just sort of fit who I was already. And it was just kind of this aha moment. And then, you know, I discovered Smash Hits magazine, and, you know, so then I got to see what it looked like, you know, what Susie Sue looked like, and how I would never look like her.
Well, that kind of leads me to kind of the question about how you came about the structure of this book. It's kind of a unique structure in terms of it. To me, it seems like it's a collection of essays, but it's also part memoir.
Yeah.
I think from what you just said, it was really important to kind of integrate your own experiences into this book. But in some ways, like, kind of what was the process in doing so? I know from my own experience, it can be a very harrowing thing in terms of who really wants to hear my life, you know? And like, I just want to stick to the subject at hand. But so how did you kind of, and I know that you're a very private person. So like, how did you kind of decide how this book was going to be kind of formulated in the end?
Yeah, it was pretty organic. I mean, like, I actually never intended to write about myself as much as I did. That was never the idea of this book in the beginning. But I think the more I talked about, like, I couldn't really talk about Strange Fruit without talking about my first experience with the song, which was the Susie and the Banshees cover. I heard that before I heard the Billie Holiday version.
Shame.
I know. Blame my parents. So I could, and so then, and that led to this comparison between how Susie Sue just sort of de-gothed it and sort of defanged this extremely powerful song. You know, and I think anytime talking about racism or sort of experiences of being marginalized or being dismissed, I kind of couldn't help but put my own experiences in that. So it kind of just sort of happened, and it ended up being this sort of flow between my life, some sort of cultural reference, and the broader historical perspective of what that was. And it ended up sort of becoming this pattern of that. But it wasn't intentional. It just sort of happened.
Well, there was two things that I wanted to ask you about, and this kind of goes into it, which is there was a story that you told about wearing a Depeche Mode Black Celebration T-shirt,
Yeah.
and the elderly black man said to you, like, he thought it was like Black Power.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. No, he was literally like, I was standing, I think it might have been actually outside our church, and I had, this Depeche Mode T-shirt on, and this sort of, older black man, he goes like, yeah, like, we should celebrate. And I was like, yeah, sure. And he said, like, is there a special event happening or something? And I'm like, well, there's a show coming up that I'm seeing, and I'm getting confused, and he's getting confused. And then it kind of hit me, and I was like, oh, it's a band. Like, this is what it was, a band T-shirt, right? And I kind of turned around and showed the back of it. And he just goes, oh. And then I just got, like, shamed all of a sudden somehow. And I never really thought about it. I was like, yeah, here's another example of blackness being negative. Here's a sort of another Black Day. And the fact that he immediately saw it as a cultural thing, about something that had to do with himself as a black person and me as a black person. And the fact that it never even crossed my mind. I just got like taken down a bunch of notches on the sidewalk by some stranger. But yeah, it made me think about, it was embarrassing. Because I felt like I've just disappointed my elders by liking Depeche Mode.
And you've also kind of shamed the race.
Yes.
Because you're not listening to black music.
Yes. Yeah. I think we talked about that a little bit. The idea of that there is black music and white music, and there's this idea that goth is like for white people, or it's a white people genre or whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's another quote I wanted to read from your book. Quote, apparently, I've never been black enough to satisfy anyone, black or white. Ralph Ellison described blackness as something elseness, a phrase that has an uncanny quality, a weird inconceivability, which felt pretty applicable to me. So as you were just saying, you share experiences that are similar to a lot of black people that do not conform to stereotypical blackness, a notion that leads to the regulation of what and how black people should be in order to be deemed authentically black, both in the eyes of blacks and non-blacks. So what are your observations of how natural gravitations to non-black musical styles is seen as a betrayal? And I just wanted to quickly add that you and I are about the same age.
Yeah.
So we both grew up in an era where the radio kind of formulated our musical, what we listened to.
Yeah.
And it just was natural to be gravitated towards just music in general.
And for you, that was metal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, how did that, and even writing this book in some ways, is seen as something, quote unquote, unique.
Yeah.
For a beautiful middle-aged black woman like yourself. I'm older than you, so.
Just a smidge.
Yeah, just a smidge.
I kind of really like that question of why is it that liking white music is seen somehow as a betrayal of blackness? And I kind of never really thought about it. And I think it's because music is, or can be for a lot of people, it was for me, so much tied with identity and so much tied with who you are. And the music you listen to, it isn't just a matter of taste. It really becomes an extension of yourself. And because black music is so vital and has been so vital in the life and the survival and in the struggle and the uplift and in the, surpassing almost all of Black history is tied to Black music, from slave, from Negro spirituals to field songs, jazz, the blues, all the way up to hip hop. Music has been this way of expressing what it's like to be Black in America. And I think for some people it feels like, because it's so tied to who you are, it feels like if you don't like black music, you don't like black people. Or if you like white music, you want to be white, or you prefer white people or something.
Yeah.
And it's really hurtful when it comes from other black people.
Word.
Yeah. Because you spent, 400 years having people say, you can do this, you can do that, you can like this, you can't like that. And the more definitions, there's this entire joke of like black people do this and white people do that, right? And I think goth kind of falls into the kind of steampunk Renaissance fair kind of crazy shit white people do thing that black people don't do. And the more categories you have that we don't do, or that we're not supposed to do, or that are not black, the more definitions you have of blackness, the more dehumanizing it is. The more you can define someone, the more you can police them, the more you can control them, and the more you can repress them. So hearing other black people being judgmental for me just being myself is particularly painful. Because it's like, there's enough people who say I can't do what I'm not supposed to do, So to hear that from someone, of your same race is hurtful.
Is there freedom in melancholy?
Yes. Oh my God, absolutely. And particularly in, again, going back to sort of the history of oppression and blackness, there's a history of the repression and control of affect of black people, from being on the slave, on the coffle, and being forced to dance and smile, and sing while you're being sold, to hide your terror and despair and misery. All of those things are human. And I think there's this history of trying to control the spectrum of black emotions. Like you're an angry black woman or an angry black man or something. Or you're, smiling, Uncle Tom or something. So there's this limit to where and when black people are supposed to emote. And I think because of the rawness of sorrow and the depth that sorrow is, it's not like a fierce anger of people yelling and screaming that you can automatically say, oh, that's a dangerous person because they're throwing chairs because they're so angry. Melancholy and sorrow, it can be very internal, but it is a very human condition. And I think part of, I think melancholy and the expression of melancholy can be a revolutionary act. I mean, I think the things like Black Lives Matter and Say Their Name, all that's mourning. It's all crying out to people to remember these people who have died, So I think there is a way that public mourning becomes an act of protest. So I do think that there's something kind of revolutionary about being publicly sad.
Right.
As a black person.
I wanted to kind of get this in because this part of the book kind of really stood out to me. In the chapter When Doves Cry, there's a myriad of things that you cover within this chapter, but one of the things that struck out to me was, in some ways, Black Death in New York, underneath our space, like underneath these lived spaces.
Yeah. Probably under here somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, Leila did a lot of research in New York City in terms of going to various spaces where people had found the bodies of African American slaves hidden underground. Yeah. You mentioned Wall Street. Yeah. Or even thinking about, you mentioned a passage about even the Biggie Smalls mural in Bed-Stuy, and how it's, when it's framed in this space, it seems like, in some ways, it's almost invisible. Like it's only it's relevant for the people that live in that space, but is it really relevant?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with all of these sites, and there's been this discovery of various African burial grounds throughout the city, and kind of everywhere, kind of pops up every now and then. Every time a building comes down and they find bones and they have to do an archaeological, examination, these new things keep coming up, right? And the thing with all of these spaces is they're sort of sharing space with the people who oppress them. They're kind of, and it becomes, instead of a memorial to a person, it becomes a memorial to an idea. It becomes the African burial ground, not the grave of, Mrs. Jones Smith or whoever. And it becomes this sort of symbol of something else besides individual sorrow, and it becomes a part of the infrastructure, as opposed to it being a grave marker in a cemetery. It's a street sign, or it's on a building. So it becomes a part of the city that in many ways might have helped in the demise of that person, so to speak. But on the other hand, I think things like the murals in places like Bedside are all over the place, like the Biggie Smalls one. It is making that public statement that this person was here and they were alive and they mattered. So seeing those murals all over with rest in peace, whoever, and the candles on the sidewalk, these sort of makeshift memorials that you see on the street everywhere, all of those are kind of beautiful public cries of acknowledgement that this person existed for everyone to see. And it does become a kind of shared communal experience. So in one point, when you do have something like a mural, for Tupac, and the store next to it becomes like a hipster bar or something like that. When the gentrification happens around these spaces, it can become decorative. It can be kind of forgotten because it blends in. And the people who originally put that mural up probably don't live there anymore. So the people who remembered those people may have been displaced. So there is this kind of duality between the power of it, the power of that kind of remembrance, and the dismissal of it when those neighborhoods change or the people move on. Yeah.
One of my last questions for you is to kind of go back to the beginning and ask you, where did you get Darkly? Like, why? What is the meaning of the title of this book?
It comes from a Du Bois quote from the book Souls of Black Folks, and it's a passage from his essay of the passing of the newborn son, where he talks about his son dying and being sort of glad that his son will never have to experience what it's like to be a Black person, will never have to experience that kind of oppression. And I'll just quote it, because I always kind of get it slightly wrong. So he says, where is it? I should know it by heart by now, you'd think. I'll just read the whole quote. Within the veil he was born, said I, and there within shall he live, a Negro and a Negro's son. Blame me not if I see the world thus darkly through the veil. And my soul whispers ever to me, saying, not dead, but escaped, not bond, but free. So I guess I kind of also see the world thus darkly through the veil. And I like the idea of the veil as both this sort of line between being inside and outside of society, being othered and being a part of something, but also the line between life and death in this world and that. So that's where Darkly came from. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to open it up to some Q&A.
Hi, and firstly, thanks for coming. And
thank you all for coming out on like the coldest night of nowhere.
And do forgive me if this question is inappropriate. Just let me know. I came to understand Gothic themes through an LGBTQ narrative. There's some like academic work on interpreting Gothic horror literature
Yeah.
in that way, as it covers similar themes.
Yeah.
And I'm also aware that there's an existing intersectionality and difficulty with being, gay or lesbian or trans or bi
Yeah.
or intersex and a person of color, because often even in the communities of color, there is less acceptance towards people who don't have the gender identity expected of them or the sexual identity expected of them.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak regarding that kind of intersectionality as you know of it, from your perspective.
Yeah, there's actually a new book that just came out called Queer Gothic, I think that's what it's called. And it talks a lot about the similarities between trauma and had trauma as an expression of the Gothic. So I think that there are a lot of similarities with marginalized groups and people who are considered othered, and people who are considered monstrous. People are considered so different as to not be quite human, which Black people have been, which Native people have been, which queer people have been, right? So I think one of the interesting things about the Gothic is that it kind of looks at that otherness and looks at it from the perspective of kind of the other a little bit. I always like to remind people that Frankenstein was the monster in the story of Frankenstein. The doctor, the scientist, was the cruel one. It's the monster who was the victim there, And so I think everything that I kind of said about Blackness in terms of the Gothic, I do think can have an equivalency in queerness. And I would recommend getting that book if I'm getting the title right, because it just came out and it's really good.
Any other questions?
Patience, because it's not a fully formed question, but I'm excited to have the two of you here because I've long been wanting to read Lena's book. And speaking to both of your experiences, kind of writing quasi-music memoirs, and your own experience, Leila, really connecting with the label goth once it came to you through music. So it's really striking to me to hear you say kind of that's almost the way that confirmed how you felt you already were. So I kind of want to hear maybe about some intersections, if any exist, between goth and metal for the two of you, if you wish to speak to those intersections, because goth and metal do have, musical intersections, if not always on the level of fashion, although there's that too. You can opt in, opt out, because some people would locate goth at the origin of fashion rather than music. So I kind of, in addition to what you've already said about the Black experience being connected to music since, what is it about kind of accepting your gothness through music that makes it particularly distinct, as opposed to kind of all these ways you almost seem to have retroactively connected it with Blackness? And anything that might happen to erupt about the intersections with metal, I wouldn't be sorry, but just
this corrosion. I think one of the things that I thought was interesting about both of our work is that a lot of your work is about anger and the freedom of expressing anger and the rebelliousness and the resisting act of showing anger as a positive thing. And mine was very much about kind of melancholy as an act of resistance and that being kind of a positive thing. I guess, I don't know, you can talk a little bit more about what you think the similarities between metal and goth are, besides being kind of counterculture or kind of emphasis on negative or something.
Yeah, that's a lot of, I'm doing my PhD right now and I'm starting my dissertation work. And I think one of the interesting things when I was reading an early draft of your book was talking about monstrosity, because that's kind of a big thing. That's one of my theoretical frameworks for my dissertation, is looking at monstrosity and the body. So I think that there's similarities in terms of the Black body within these predominantly white spaces and finding liberation through these spaces. So through these music cultures or through these artistic cultures. I think in some ways for Leila, it's more maybe an intellectual and an emotional liberation or a mode of thinking, which causes or the people involved find a freedom and an individuality through goth. And for me, it's similar in terms of the people that the young black men and women I have talked to over the many years who are really into the metal scene, especially into the extreme underground scene, which I'm really interested in, is finding a sense through the anger, through the chaos, through the public consternation. They're finding their own freedom and liberation, not just through, let's say, anger or harshness or whatever, but just a place and a space to be individuals outside of all of this messiness that's happening in mainstream culture. Yeah. So I think that's one reason why we're friends is because we're on the same level in terms of thinking about our own freedom and liberation and what we've gotten through the music that has been passionate to both of us since we were both kids, really. But also kind of thinking about ways through these artistic practices that bring about kind of emotions that society is telling us, especially as black women or women of color, to oppress.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers your question. Hey.
I haven't read it yet, but I was curious if in your research or writing, was there something that you found that, like maybe you went in with one idea and then it shifted like maybe a 180 and then you came out with a different or a discovery?
Besides the whole book, I think probably, I don't know. I mean, I think there are things that came out that I didn't expect to come out. I think one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was haunting and haunted houses, and that ended up, which kind of led into the whole section on Detroit and stuff. And I think that section was a lot of stuff I never thought of before, and I never really thought of my hometown in that way before, as something that I always felt kind of inherently, but never really defined. So I think kind of trying to put this laser focus on that. And actually the other thing that I would say that another kind of spark was looking at these comparisons of music between, and I'm going to mention it again because it's fascinating, is the difference between Susie Sue's version of Strange Fruit and Billie Holiday's version of Strange Fruit. And what that does to that song. And in listening back to Susie Sue's music, I was thinking of the Passenger, which is another Color Iggy Pop song, and finding that the lyrics, and I made a little playlist on Spotify for this book, so, go on Twitter and you'll find it. But her musical choices are so kind of evocative of her whiteness, really. And I think I never really planned on kind of dissing Susie Sue as much as I did, and I love Susie Sue, and I hope she never finds this book. But yeah, I found some in Edgar Allan Poe and getting into a lot of problematic heroes, especially Poe. Or problematic fave. So I think it was really sort of more, it wasn't necessarily ideas that shifted, but it was more sort of discovering things I never really thought about before, more than that,
Sort of following in the footsteps of this question, once I got the concept for your book, I started sort of lensing all of my entire life as a black kid through the goth mindset. And I was like, we're goth as fuck. What the hell? When you look at African diasporic religions, there's a lot of goth shit going on in there.
Yeah.
And when I look at music, because my take on music is you have us to thank for pretty much every genre in the US, so I'm going to claim all of them as ours originally, and what you did with it is fine. But did you find that this sort of shifted your mindset in a way to say, look, we really are not just rooted in gothness? And the Billie Holiday example really got me, because one of her other famous songs, Gloomy Sunday, is goth as hell. It's like a song about suicide. You know, and it's beautiful. And you look at the original versions of that versus how she covered it. And it lives in death with her cover versus the original sort of, I'm sad, I'm gonna die, the end. You know, where she takes you on this amazing journey. So I was just curious if that sort of, that lens sort of put you into a every day is Halloween kind of mindset around Blackness and Gothic idealism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think once, and I've kind of always kind of had this perspective, but once I really started focusing on it, you realize that sort of everything that I'm experiencing has this sort of goth filter over it. And again, I should also clarify how I'm talking about goth. There's my cultural goth, which is the 80s, you know, and it's a very kind of specific time for goth, you know. But I also think that goth has grown and expanded in a lot of different ways, and there's all these sort of little subsects of goth, and like I don't really understand cyber goth, but I know it's a thing. You know, yeah, I mean, I think when I started expanding what my own personal feelings of what goth was, other kinds of music and other kinds of art, like Kara Walker's stuff is very gothic to me. All of that kind of sort of expanding things. Like Tricky, I think, is really goth. Yeah, I mean, and I think no one would think of, I don't think anyone would think of Tricky as a goth band, as a goth artist, but there is a very, very goth or gothic quality to his work. So when you start sort of looking at all this stuff from your own perspective, things that people don't think of as being goth became really goth to me, and I'm kind of surprised that no one else saw it, because they're just focused on, you know, I don't know, Hot Topic or whatever. Sorry, they're just Hot Topic.
Hey, how's it going? I'm just kind of curious, because two of the terms you've been using tonight that I think in like culture at large are often sort of interchangeable, but I often wonder if they are melancholy and mourning. Yeah. In fact, like Freud is very specific about these are in fact two different things. So I'm just sort of curious, the way that you're using those terms, do you see them as doing different things? Do you see them as related? What is that relationship between mourning and melancholy for you? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's sort of the difference is in mourning, and this is, you know, Freud, there is an object, there's a person, there's a thing that is lost, and it dies or goes away, and there's this process. There's this process of going through it and it kind of fading, and there's kind of a beginning, middle, and end to mourning. And melancholy is kind of a permanent condition of mourning. There is no beginning and there is no end. And for me, the experience of Blackness is an inherent melancholic condition. Slavery never really ended. It just sort of changed and morphed and kept going. There is no original lost person. It's millions of people. So there is no one singular focus that you could say, I lost this, and I'm going through this process of mourning, and I can replace it with this. It's this very nebulous, undefined kind of thing, which is what the melancholic condition is. So I think that, to me, is more kind of what I'm going for than with mourning. But in terms of aesthetics, I think part of the performance of goth and goth culture, and a lot of fashion and a lot of the culture around it is around a culture of mourning, like the Victorian mourning, kind of maybe specifically, and a lot of the kind of performance of mourning. So I think there is kind of a swoon aspect to goth, you know, that has to do with kind of ritualized mourning practices. But I think in terms of the Black experience, I think that is more about melancholy, you know. And I don't mean like everyone's walking around like weeping all the time. I just mean that it's sort of this underlying presence that kind of affects everything, whether you kind of know it or not. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and I hope you'll join me in giving a round of applause for Leila and Laina. Leila, if you'd like to sign some books, you have this table
I
up
would love
here.
to sign
If
some
you all
books.
have a copy of Darkly that
Sure.
you'd like to get signed, we're going to line up right where I'm standing on my right, your left side of the room. If you don't have a copy, you can grab one from me at the register.